The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or good morning to everybody, depending on where you are right now. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar on the 2021 Canadian Anti-Doping Program, with a focus today on the highlights of the final changes, and in particular, answering any questions or concerns that you may have. For your information, before we get started, the webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available afterward for anyone who was unable to participate live today. My name is Elizabeth Carson, and I've been leading the CCES's CADP consultation process. And I'm joined by a few colleagues. We have David Leck, Principal Drafter of the CADP, Jeremy Luke, Senior Director of Sport Integrity, and Amanda Lanthier. And everyone will be able to provide some additional insight as part of the overview and help with any questions that you may have as we get to the question period. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. Everyone's on mute just to make sure we can get through it smoothly, reduce the background noise, of course. And we will take questions following the overview of the changes. So we have some time set aside for questions and answers, and you can use the Ask a Question function that's in GoToWebinar or the chat to send a question or to just indicate that you have a question. And we can unmute you during the Q&A so that you can have the floor and ask your question or make your comment. And there's a French webinar later this afternoon, but you're more than welcome to ask a question in French if you would like. I'll turn the floor over to Jeremy for just a quick opening remark. Jeremy?
Thanks very much, Liz. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone on the webinar. I hope you're all doing well. On behalf of the CCS, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for your contributions and support to the development of the 2021 Canadian Anti-Doping Program. As you know, on October 15th, the CCS released the final version of the 2021 CADP, and that version was also sent to the World Anti-Doping Agency and has been reviewed by WADA, and it has been confirmed to meet all of the requirements of the 2021 World Anti-Doping Code. As you're aware, this process involved fairly extensive consultation with the Canadian sport community, dating back to the spring and then throughout the summer until where we find ourselves today. It's included dedicated sessions with Athletes Can and athletes, a number of focus groups with targeted stakeholders such as the SDRCC and arbitrators. It involved surveys to athletes as well as surveys to national and multi-sport organizations. We've held 2 different dedicated webinars, and we've received numerous written submissions from many of you. I mention this as hopefully it resonates that this program is a collective effort and one that includes the views and thoughts and suggestions from the sport community, and that it is in a very good place as we head into 2021. Thank you again for your contributions today, and I'll turn the floor back over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Jeremy. So by way of a brief background, as Jeremy touched on the World Anti-Doping Code, it's reviewed along with the international standards every 6 years. And the World Anti-Doping Agency approved the final version of the 2021 code and several of the international standards at the World Conference on Doping in Sport last year in November. And the code is the document that harmonizes the regulations regarding anti-doping across all sports, across all countries around the world. When the code's revised, signatories like Canada have to make sure that their own rules and policies are in compliance with those mandatory articles and the other principles of the code. In Canada, the code's applied through the implementation of the Canadian Anti-Doping Program, the CADP. So the CCS has revised the 2015 CADP and created the 2021 CADP, as Jeremy mentioned, through collaborative effort with a number of different organizations. And the feedback that we've received through the consultation period has been incorporated into the 2021 CADP, which has been released and takes effect on the 1st of January 2021. So we'll take you through a summary of the major changes from the 2015 CADP to this final version of the 2021 CADP and what they mean for your organization moving forward. Again, we'll take questions towards the end of the webinar, so you can keep note and send us a note through the questions function to let us know that you did have a question or a comment to add to the question and answer portion at the end. Excuse me. So the first of which of the changes is regarding the 6-month requirement. The CADP requires that any athlete be subject to testing for a substantial period of time prior to international participation. And the purpose of the requirement is to ensure that athletes cannot avoid being subject to testing by joining sport organizations on the eve of competitions. So the period itself remains 6 months. However, we've revised the requirement to include the ability to grant exemptions in circumstances where it would otherwise be unfair or unreasonable to the athlete to have requested that 6 months notice have been given. Internal reviews. Following an anti-doping rule violation, there's now a requirement for the relevant sport organization to review and identify the circumstances or factors specific to the sport, the athlete, or the organization that might have contributed to the violation. So the goal of this review is not to investigate the anti-doping rule violation itself. Rather, it's to identify lessons learned, if there are any, from the violation and improvements that could be undertaken in an attempt to prevent similar occurrences. And the CCS will provide tools and templates to facilitate such a review. And the sport organization would then share the relevant factors or circumstances with the CCS, together with any required steps for improvement. In terms of membership gaps, the jurisdiction of the CADP applies primarily to athletes by way of their membership in a sport organization that's adopted the CADP. So if or when a membership lapses, it often means the CADP no longer applies to that athlete. Athletes who join sport organizations are subject to the rules of the sport organization and thus subject to the CADP. In addition, the National Athlete Pool, the NAP members, who are subject to the CADP will expressly agree in the athlete contract that they'll remain subject to the CADP regardless of their membership status within a sport organization until they're removed from the NAP or they retire, whichever they do first. The jurisdiction of the CADP extends to the athlete support personnel who are involved in the sport. And that includes coaches, trainers, managers, agents, team staff, officials, medical, paramedical personnel, even parents. It's a very broad group. Certain designated athlete support personnel who assist athletes at the NAP level or above in each sport, or at Canadian sports centers or Canadian sport institutes to helping them to prepare for competitions, will be required to complete online education and sign an agreement to expressly confirm that the designated individual is indeed subject to the CADP and has been appropriately educated. This requirement will only apply to a relatively small number of all the coaches, trainers, or individuals who are assisting athletes in Canada. And during the adoption period, the CCS will work with the organizations adopting the CADP to help determine who those designated athlete support personnel will be and provide additional resources that are required, such as the education. The 2021 code includes a comment that permits international federations to use the data that's collected from a doping control test to monitor eligibility related to gender verification and other eligibility rules. But in the 2021 CADP, we've made it express that the CCS will not use such data for any other purpose other than legitimate anti-doping purposes. During WADA's consultation process, the Athletes Anti-Doping Rights Act was introduced. The Act outlines various athlete rights with respect to the fight against doping in sport and aims to further support athletes worldwide in their right to compete in clean, fair, and ethical sport. The CADP incorporates the Act directly into the rules. The Act includes the athlete's rights, which are also contained in the Code and the international standards. But in addition, there are 3 recommended rights, which the CCS is committed to upholding. First, the athletes have the right to an anti-doping system that is free from corruption, which means, for example, that all reasonable steps have been taken to eliminate doping in sport. Second, the athletes have the right to participate in governance and decision-making. For example, they can comment on and are consulted in the creation and modification of the CADP. And the CCS maintains an anti-doping advisory committee in cooperation with Athletes Can on anti-doping matters. And finally, athletes have the right to legal aid. For example, representation by pro bono legal counsel at hearings conducted by the SDRCC and hearings and appeals with no fees payable to the SDRCC. Under the 2021 Code, officers, directors, and certain employees of signatories who are involved in any aspect of doping control are also made subject to the Code. This will include the CCS and sport organizations that have adopted the CADP. This doesn't mean the individuals will be tested. Rather, they'll need to acknowledge that the sport organization they're participating with, in whatever capacity relating to doping control, has adopted the CADP. And in consequence of the CADP becoming a policy of that sport organization, they're subject to the CADP and will not commit applicable anti-doping rule violations under the Code, such as tampering, trafficking, administration, and complicity. Athletes who retire are required to provide the CCS 6 months notice prior to returning to international or national competition. That was always the case previously. But retired athletes seeking an exemption to this rule will not be permitted to compete until the decision to grant an exemption has been made by WADA, and if applicable, any subsequent appeal has been heard. The 2021 CADP includes a new anti-doping specific approach to dealing with hearings and appeals, and the ability of the parties who are involved to seek reimbursement of certain expenses from the other party. The doping panel could order that one party pay a portion of the expenses of another party if their conduct throughout a proceeding has been demonstrably unreasonable or where they've acted in bad faith. The focus will be on the party's conduct during the arbitration, not on the outcome of the arbitration. It's expected this type of order would be rare, but factors that'll be taken into account include the nature, the extent, the impact of any unreasonable or bad faith conduct that's increased the expenses, the complexity of the issues, and proportionality. In an effort to hold sport organizations more accountable for their participants, the 2021 CADP incorporates a fine if significant doping is occurring in that sport and if the organization fails to conduct the required internal review or fails to implement the recommended actions, which was mentioned earlier. For example, if 3 athletes in one sport received the maximum sanctions for an anti-doping rule violation within a rolling 12-month period, and the organization fails to conduct an internal review or fails to implement the recommended actions stemming from such a review, the sport organization may have to pay a fine. Athletes can request a public hearing, which consists of a publicly accessible audio link to the doping panel's proceedings. In the normal course, 3 arbitrators will hear all doping appeals, but if all the parties involved in the decision under appeal agree in writing, a single arbitrator may be appointed to the doping tribunal to sit as the doping appeal panel. Substances of abuse are a new category included in the CADP, which identifies the substances that are frequently abused in society outside the context of sport. So cocaine, heroin, MDMA, and THC have been identified as the 4 substances of abuse in WADA's 2021 prohibited list. Athletes who commit violations for these substances may have their sanctions reduced if they can demonstrate that the use was out of competition and unrelated to sport performance, in which case the suspension imposed would now be 3 months. This suspension may be further reduced to 1 month if the athlete completes an approved treatment program. Since we're going into from one set of rules to another set of rules, the CADP does include transitional provisions whereby an athlete who is serving a period of ineligibility on January 1st, 2021 can apply for a sanction reduction should the new rules in the 2021 CADP contain provisions that are more favorable to the athlete. In particular, the CCS will be reviewing all cases involving an athlete who may be serving a sanction on January 1st, 2021 for substances of abuse to determine whether the new rules would be more favorable to that athlete. And if so, the new sanctioning regime would apply in place of the current one and will be applied. I'll pause here. That's the overview of the major changes that will come into effect in January. But I'll pause to review if there's any questions that have come in. And if not, go ahead and you can raise your hand too if you did have a question or a comment for the panel that we have here. I'll check in with Amanda if you'd seen any questions.
No questions so far.
Okay. Jeremy or David, was there anything that you might want to add or clarify to the summary so far?
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Oh, thanks very much, David. Nothing to clarify, just indicate to the group that please feel free, of course, to ask any questions you might have now, but if they come to mind following the webinar later on, don't hesitate to reach out to Elizabeth and we can always respond to your questions at that point in time as well. David, anything you'd like to add?
Really just one point around this concept of a designated athlete support personnel. The reason I've been focusing on it a lot is, of course, we're quite used to having athletes in the National Athlete Pool sign contracts confirming that the CADP applies to them. It's entirely new this year that some, certainly not all, but some athlete support personnel will have to sign these same contracts. And I really would urge the sports to give some thought to whom it makes sense to have this obligation apply. We've had discussions with youth sports and CCAA. They're very unique in terms of all of the various institutions, but every sport will have different needs and concerns. And we want to be sensible, but we really do want to reach the key players who are athlete support personnel, first of all, so they can be educated. That's the primary goal. And secondly, that they expressly confirm that the CADP will apply to them. So I think it's really important to say that even if no one signs, the rules themselves state that the CADP does apply, but this category of being a designated athlete support personnel, essentially it means that they're almost a key man, a key player. They need to be educated. These are folks who are playing an active role in the training and working with elite athletes. And so every sport will have a different figuration of who that should be. And as Elizabeth said, this is what we'll be working with through the fall to try to help you understand and appropriately designate the right cohort of people who will be this designated athlete support personnel. So we don't want to make it an impossible task. We see it as a benefit to bring these people on board through education and expressly confirm that they are subject to it. So again, I just reiterate that because it's entirely new and we really are going to need the feedback from each sport to help us understand who those individual athlete support personnel should be. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you, David. I see we have a question from Tracy Blake. I'm going to unmute you, Tracy. And you'll just have to unmute yourself. Let's see. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So my question was around, I can't remember which slide it was, but it said that the data that was collected by CCES CCES would only be used for doping, but that the International Sport Federation could request the data to be used for other processes such as gender verification, etc. So I get that CCS isn't using the data in that way, but are they still obliged to provide the data so another organization can use it in that way? And are we, as the support staff, consenting to that one with our compliance and our compliance agreement with the new policy?
Thanks for the question. Jeremy?
Sure, thanks, Liz. Maybe I'll start, and then David, I'll pass it off to you to add to the response. Thanks for your question, Tracy. Just to provide a little further background, in the final, there's a fourth version of the World Anti-Doping Code, the 2021 code. A provision was added into that draft version, which expressly allowed for international sport federations to use data from sample analysis for non-anti-doping purposes. And that was added into the fourth version, and then it was ultimately approved by the World Anti-Doping Agency in the final version of the code. And the CCS reached out to WADA in the summer to understand the rationale for why that was added into the World Anti-Doping Code. As in the past, the CCS has always viewed data that's collected through the Canadian Anti-Doping Program as being for anti-doping purposes only. So we reached out. Our understanding in speaking with WADA was the reason it was added was that there are certain international sport federations who have other policies such as gender verification, code of conduct, safety or medical related policies, and they wanted to be able to use data from sample analysis for those purposes, which is why it was added. But it's essentially optional. It's not required that signatories do that. So the CCS, based on a webinar we held in the summer and the views that we heard from the Canadian sport community, wrote into the CADP that we would not do that, and that it's our view that data collected from sample analysis should only be used for anti-doping purposes. And we wrote that into the CADP so that anything we collect is done in that way. We are required to share information with the World Anti-Doping Agency, which is why we also added a provision that we're not sure that once that data is shared with WADA and it is made available to other signatories, if they have those policies, they may be able to use the data for those other purposes. So that's our understanding of the situation and how we wrote it into the CADP. David, maybe you could elaborate on how those signatories might choose to use that data, and then how that might impact Canadian sport organizations.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think the likely way that international federations or other organizations would use the data is once the data is uploaded into the ADAMS data management system. So we could do a test on a Canadian athlete in Canada. That information must be shared with WADA and other anti-doping organizations through this management systems called ADAMS. It's from ADAMS that essentially will be the way that other entities would be able to use data on Canadian athletes that CCS has obtained. But I think there are two very important caveats. The first is it needs to be a legitimate purpose, a valid legitimate purpose. So WADA has been pretty clear. Jeremy mentioned a few: code of conduct, eligibility. All of these have been validated. People may disagree with them, but they are all proper and valid purposes. So there needs to be a valid purpose and the consent of the data subject. So I think it's critically important for everyone to understand that CCS will not use the data for anything other than anti-doping purposes. But if a Canadian athlete's data was to be used by a third party for other valid, legitimate purposes, the consent of that athlete would have to be obtained. This in no way mitigates the requirement to obtain consent. So athletes whose data could be used for other than anti-doping purposes will have to give their consent to that happening. And I think as part of your question, Really, it was, is there implied consent because CCS or other sport organizations were involved in the collection of this data? I think I'm pretty confident to say the answer is no. There needs to be express consent for the data subjects involved to allow these other international federations to use that data. So it is possible. The main point we wanted to stress is even though we don't intend to do it with Canadian generated data on Canadian athletes, we can't say it will never happen. But I think we can say if it does happen, it has to be for a legitimate purpose and with valid consent. So I hope that gives some comfort to you in terms of how that information may be used outside of Canada.
Yes, thank you very much.
Great, we have a few questions, so I'm just going to tee up JP, Mike, Antoine, and Dan. I'll start with JP to go next. I'll just make sure you're unmuted. And you can unmute and go ahead with your question, JP.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My question pertains to the signature for staff and the definition that you are suggesting, paraphrasing close staff to the athletes. Would it be possible, since, sports are clustered differently, engine sport, power sport, cyclical sport, and team sports, would it be possible to provide some, not guidelines, but examples of, which staff, we should consider. And from there, we could, further explore instead of, everyone starting from scratch and try to define what it is. So just kind of a bit more guidelines. And if I missed that information, apologies on my end.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great question, JP. Essentially, through each of the individual NSO meetings that we'll be having, we will discuss on a case-by-case basis who makes the most sense to make up that designated pool of athlete support personnel. And initial thinking would be anyone who is under contract by the NSO, so someone that is employed, for example, a head coach, perhaps, would be a good starting point to think of who you'd like included. And we really will work with each individual sport and each individual discipline even to determine which group makes the most sense. And then we do have education available that will be mandatory for this pool of athlete support personnel. And as part of that, the contract, the acknowledgement that they're subject to the CADP is part of that. So there won't be any need to do any signatures by email or anything like that. It'll all be done electronically as part of the education process. So it'll all be grouped as one thing they need to do, providing the education and the sign off at the same time. But it will vary probably quite widely from sport to sport, which types of people are included. But if you think from the perspective of people who are contracted to the organization, that's a good starting point, and then expand from there.
And JP, I think there's a comment we put in, and this follows up with what Elizabeth said. Certainly contract individuals, so national team head coaches, those are the obvious places to start. But I think we also use language when other individuals are supervised by the national sport organization. And really what I was thinking about there are, for instance, team doctors. Like the doctors obviously aren't employed, but they might travel regularly with the national team. They might provide regular, medical care and treatment to Canadian athletes. These are the type of people where in that role, they're clearly supervised. Their role is managed by the national sport organization. These are also people that we think you need to think about. So it does go beyond those that you're in a contractual relationship with, because we understand that there are many mission critical folks assisting elite athletes who don't have a contractual relationship with the sport. But we want to work with you to try to see who makes sense to bring into this pool of people who get additional education.
Thank you, David. I'll turn the floor next to Mike Slipchuk. You're unmuted.
My question's the same as what's been asked here about that support personnel, and I guess I'll just wait till we have our meeting. But I looked at our sport. We don't have a head coach. We don't have a contracted coach that works with our athletes. So our coaches are all self-employed. Every athlete has their own coaching team. And even from a medical perspective, is we do have a lead CMO, but it's more a CMO position that's in Canada. Our medical team that travels with our athletes can number close to 30 plus medical personnel over a season. So it's going to just take us some time to really figure out how this works for our sport, because that'd be a lot of people to have to go through that process.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we'll definitely get into that through each meeting to understand the nuances of how every different team and sport has that entourage within the sport. Antoine, I'm going to just double check that you're unmuted. And Antoine, you can go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Liz. Just adding to what GP and Mike just said, is about the support personnel. Are you discussing also with CSIs? Because a lot of athletes see people, medical personnel at the CSI level, and their CSI people are not part of the NSOs. So who are identifying them? And my second question is, what's the work that needs to be done at the major games level, the Olympic, Commonwealth, Paralympics, Universiad, so that are we requiring those people also to be educated because they're not part of the NSOs because they come as a core team? So what do we do with all those non-NSO practitioners or support personnel?
Yeah,
and who's identifying them?
Yeah, great question. And yes, we do work with the sport institutes and sport centers. They all sign the CADP covenant. So they don't adopt the CADP in the same way as the NSO community does, since they don't necessarily have the athletes as members. So the rules wouldn't make sense to apply in the same way. However, they are obviously partners in the anti-doping world. So they do sign the covenant. And as part of that, the education is available. And I think we'll work with them to, again, similarly, try to identify people who are regularly working with the athletes and have them complete some education. As support personnel to the athletes, it's important that they're aware of the rules that apply to them, and they would certainly meet the criteria of being a designated athlete support personnel. So we'll work with them to determine the best way forward in that sense. Similarly, with the games community as well, we can probably work together to identify key staff that should be educated, given their involvement and close proximity to helping these athletes at the highest level.
And again, let me jump in. It was stated already, but I think it's really important to understand that the World Anti-Doping Code and of course the CADP defines athlete support personnel incredibly broadly. It's anybody who's assisting an athlete prepare for sport competition, including parents. So we were faced with the challenge of that defines an enormous pool of Canadian individuals. And so what we needed to do is try to identify a much smaller subset who would receive the benefit of education. So the point I'm trying to make is if you don't necessarily sign one of these contracts, it doesn't mean that the CADP doesn't apply to you. We simply want to make it easier if one of this smaller designated pool were to get involved in doping activity, that first of all, they'd be educated about the risks of doing so. And secondly, it would be easier for us to prosecute those individuals if there was an express acknowledgement that the rules and the discipline in the CADP applied to them. So essentially, we haven't done this before. The last two iterations of the code and the CADP just had the definition of athlete support personnel, very broad. This is the first year where we're trying to make some subset of those folks expressly acknowledge that it does in fact apply to them with the link to education. So this is why I raised it at the first. It's a significant change. We want it to work. We think it's helpful, but we're going to need absolutely feedback on a sport by sport basis to make it work.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Our last question is going to be taken care of at individual meetings, so no problems there. I don't see any new hands raised. So I'm not seeing any new questions. As Jeremy said, if there are additional questions that come up as you ponder the changes or anything else related to the CADP, just feel free to reach out, whether it's to your sport coordinator, to myself, anyone else from the team. We're happy to take the questions throughout this process, of course. Before we wrap it up, I will remind everyone of the next steps. With the release of the final version of the CADP, which was on October 15th, the national and multi-sport organizations with athletes as members are now required to formally adopt the CADP by December 31st, 2020. So before it comes into force on January 1st, 2021. In terms of next steps, each adopting organization's board of directors is required to formally adopt the 2021 CADP through a board motion and provide a copy of the minutes or the motion, even just the excerpt from that portion of the meeting to the CCS. And the adoption contract also needs to be signed by December 31st and returned to CCS. The CCS will be in touch to arrange the annual winter meetings that I've referenced, which will include reviewing the responsibilities outlined in the contract, identifying the group of designated athlete support personnel, and updating the national athlete pool. Support is provided by the CCS throughout the adoption period, and further details and supporting documentations were sent last week to the adopting organizations. And if there are questions from that perspective, people have my contact information as well. That brings us to the end of the webinar today. On behalf of the CADP team, I want to thank you for your participation. And until next time, stay safe. Thank you, everyone.